So welcome to the first WRC meeting. We'll be talking about our priorities for the next hour or so. This is also being recorded and live streamed to YouTube, which is a bit of an experiment. So to online viewers, we're hoping to take moderated questions for this meeting and hold something like that in the future. But if you're chatting in comments right now, please be civil. Don't target WRC members for what they're doing in this meeting, or else we'll have to reconsider holding public formats. But hopefully this will be productive and positive. And if we do this again, we'll hopefully be able to reconsider holding different times of the day to accommodate WRC members and maybe different audiences for different regions of the world. For all the WRC members dialed in, please make sure to remember not to share anything confidential. Most of what we talk about, we can talk about openly, but some delegate report details like names of competitors with incidents, especially, we should not share unless for some reason that is already being discussed publicly. But err on the side of mentioning as little as possible. So if you're mentioning an example, mention we have had incidents like so-and-so rather than at this competition, this competitor did something. This has been mentioned in a few places, but just to reiterate. And as a rule of thumb, I'm going to try to keep us to the schedule as much as possible. So if you've already spoken, let's say 2 times about a topic, try to let someone else speak if they're trying to, but feel free to make your thoughts heard as much as is appropriate. I trust us to balance that. And the structure of this meeting will be first, I want to introduce everyone to go around and introduce themselves because this is the first meeting and the first time we're all talking together. Then I want to talk a bit about our processes and figure out some details based on what we've been discussing, about how to handle delegate reports and other processes that we're setting up. And then I'd like to talk about our priorities, of which the 2020 regulations are going to be the most important. And we're trying to set up several things ahead of time. So trying to put together a community survey to get thoughts from the community about what to do about some of these priorities. So with that, I think we can go to personal introductions. So my name is Lucas. I've been cubing since 2015. I picked up a cube from the back of a drawer that my mom had bought and said, this might be fun someday. And I went to a competition in 2006 at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and I did not know what competitions were like. I did not expect to compete, but somebody said, sign up. And I borrowed someone else's cube because my cube was no good, and I averaged 1.5 minutes. But then I came back for the next competition, and I've been cubing ever since. I currently still live in California near San Francisco, and during the day I work on software. So I actually work on GitHub now. I started putting a lot of cubing stuff on GitHub and moved a lot of WCA things to GitHub in the early day, but I didn't actually join GitHub until about a year ago, partially because of my good experience of working all of that. So if you ever have GitHub questions, you can come to me. And I've been reconsidering why I cube for the longest time, but I feel like I've learned a lot of my skills from cubing, and I still get a lot out of it. And I'm still trying to beat 10 seconds, so I will be around for a while. So I have a random order that I picked for people to go, which I'm going to try to go in. Ivan, could you introduce yourself?
Okay. I started cubing about 3 years ago. I went to a popular shop in the middle of Madrid. And coincidentally, Alberto Perez, which is in the WGA board, was selling the cubes, and I bought a cube. He encouraged me to go to a competition, so I went to my first competition. I only competed in 100 blindfolded, and in the next competition, I competed in all events I can. And that's why I started cubing. And right now I'm studying in the university, and I live in a little village at the south of Madrid, which is called Getafe. And if you have any question about my life,
Well, I don't have you on schedule, so if you have any a little fun story, you're welcome to share.
maybe in my first competition, I only competed in 100 and in blindfolded because I have an event the previous day, and it's not very common to compete in this event for the first competition.
Interesting. Right, thanks. Pedro, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm Pedro. I'm from Brasilia, Brazil. I'm a law student, and I'm also an intern at a law firm. And I started to compete. I learned how to solve the Rubik's Cube on 2013. When I was younger, my brother had tried to taught me. I learned how to solve the 2x2, but then I gave up. Later on in high school, a lot of my friends were solving. I started too, and I never stopped since then. My first competition was in 2014 here in Brasilia. It was wasn't really that good. On average, maybe 30 seconds, but it was fun. Competing and getting to know people. I think my interesting story, or maybe a bit sad, is that I was able to attend the 2015 World Championship in São Paulo. But because I was really young and didn't really know a lot of people, I kind of just sat there and solved a couple of times. That was it.
Well, I'm glad we stuck with it. Okay, thanks. Sydney, could you go next?
All right, my name is Sydney. I live in South Carolina. I've been cubing since 2012. I didn't begin competing until 2013, and one of the most memorable moments from my first competition was doing factory solves on the 2x2 with Chris Olsen, as he was using a very bad 2x2, an original pocket cube. I guess that's about it. Don't want to drag on too much.
Sounds good. Next, Kotaro, could you introduce yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Fine.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kotaro. I was born and raised in Japan, and I also live in Tokyo, Japan now. And I graduated from university last year, and I'm working for an internet company where I work as a software engineer. The reason I applied to WRC instead of the software team is that I want to do something different from my job. And I have another reason, that is because I started cubing since 2010. Since then, I have been working on translation of regulations. So I like to put my experience to the community. And as a competitor, my favorite event is FMC. And I have a little interesting story from my first competition. I was a teenager when I first attended the first competition. The last night of my first competition, I was so excited for the competition that I couldn't sleep well. So on the competition day, I overslept and I was late for the competition. And one of the events that I registered was already over, and I couldn't participate. I cannot remember what the event was, but it was 2x2 or 4x4. Yeah, that was the most impressive story for me.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm glad
but I'm all right. Thank you. That's it.
Well, thank you. I hear that world records have been set on no sleep the night before, but it's better to try to get some. Okay, thank you. Antonio, could you introduce yourself?
All right, so I'm Antonio. I'm a cuber from Hong Kong, and I'm currently 16, so I don't have a job or anything. I'm still in high school, my junior year. And I started cubing in 2015 when I just saw a friend at school pick up a cube, and I decided I wanted to learn it. And from then, I haven't looked back. In 2017, early 2017, if I remember correctly, I made the switch to Rue. And soon after that, in around March, I had my first competition. That competition was a side event competition, so there wasn't any 3x3 like two-handed. So the main event there was one-handed, and that was when I was still slower with Rue than CFOP, but I did use Rue for one-handed then. So basically from then I've mained Rue and only do one-handed now. So the WRC is basically the first WCA job I've had, and it's the first time I've basically contributed to the WCA, so I'm looking forward to doing more of this. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Han, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Han Wu, and I'm from Taiwan, but actually I'm now living in Japan because I'm working in Japan now. I started cubing back in 2003 when I saw the video of the first World Championship in Toronto, because I thought that was impossible until I see the video. And my first competition is in 2008 in Taipei, Taiwan. One of the memory from that competition is I succeeded in my first attempt of the 3x3 blindfolded. I think it's around 6 minutes. But after that, I had 20 in a row unsuccessful blindfolded. I'm still trying to get a good one now, and I hope I can get a successful blindfolded in next competition. Okay, thank you.
Okay, good luck. Katie, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm from Georgia in the USA. I'm also a delegate for Georgia. I started cubing in 2008 when a kid in my middle school brought one, and I really wanted to learn for some reason, so he taught me about a step a day for about half a year. And I finally learned, and I went to my first competition in 2010 in Georgia. And I guess one of my favorite memories from that competition was I just remember I really wanted to podium, and I ended up podiuming in Magic, so that's clearly my best achievement in my cubing career. I graduated college last year, and I'm currently editing videos part-time for a nonprofit.
All right, thank you. Jules, could you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Jules. I'm French, but I'm currently living in Germany, in Stuttgart. I'm an electronic engineer for a company that builds satellites. I've been cubing since 2009 and started competing in 2010, and I'm almost up to 100 competitions. And I joined WRC by the end of 2017, so right after the new regulations were posted. So, yeah, I guess that's it.
All right. Clément?
Hi, I'm Clément from France. I know Jules from my very first competition in 2014. He set a European record at this competition. I think I'm the guy with the most comps in the WRC. I'm like 110 something. I joined WCAT last November and WRC recently. And the fun story about me is that the first time I solved a cube was with the last layer skip. I didn't know how to solve the last layer, only the first 2 layers. And then I reached once last layer, it was solved. And that's how I solved my first cube. I think that's all.
Okay. Can someone read what Oleg sent us?
Yep, I'm on it. So Oleg sadly could not attend the meeting, and he said, "Hi, I'm Oleg Gritsenko. I originate from Russia, started cubing in 2011, became a delegate in 2013, 4 years ago. He moved to Switzerland, where he's living now with his wife. And in 2016, he joined WRC, and he's a software engineer or programmer. And he really likes languages, I can relate, and playing piano, traveling, and hiking.
Okay, thank you. I think that should be everyone. So I just realized I didn't mention my WCA history. It's a long history. So 8 of you are new. Oleg and Jules are the only ones, along with me, who have been around for a while. Last year we had 7 members, but everyone keeps getting promoted out by joining the board or becoming a senior delegate or something like that, which I guess is a good problem to have. And I started the WRC sort of by accident around 2011, 2012. I was involved with Scramblers and Tyson Mao at the time. I sort of offered to clean up the regulations for him and did that. And I didn't mean to be leader, but I've been co-leader once, and nowadays committees and teams can't have 2 leaders, so I'm leader again. And in that time, I've probably authored more than half of the regulations changes, maybe closer to 3/4. But I'm trying to hand off as much responsibility as possible to others so that we have a sustainable process. So it's really great to have this many members. I guess to disclose some things publicly, we had 30 total applicants for the Regulations Committee, and I think we were able to take 8 people, which makes 11 total. More than that would have been tricky, so we had to turn down some qualified people. We do a lot of work out in the open whenever possible, so I'm hoping that people contribute ideas or actual proposals. We're trying to work on making this easier and better. So for example, people don't always know what the best proposal format is. It's basically say, I think this should happen. This is the words that should change in the regulations. Here's why this is good, and here's why this might not be so good. And but I still think we should do it. So I'm trying to move us to a more structured process like that. But first, let me pull up some processes I want to discuss here. Let me make sure I get the correct one pulled up. Is a screen visible with the GitHub?
Yep.
Okay. So current processes. We've been discussing a little bit how to handle delegate reports. This is the most private aspect of what we work on because delegate reports right now are not public. So we have an automated process right now to send an email to assign delegate reports, just so that everyone gets read by at least one WRC member, and most of them will have no issue. And so currently the de facto process is that if you're assigned, there's a primary or secondary, you should email whoever else is assigned and the delegates and me, so we know you've reviewed it, but there's no need to notify the entire team. Does this still seem like a reasonable default to everyone?
I would prefer to be notified as well, just if it's okay. It doesn't add much inconvenience, but everyone knows that it was taken care of, and they can just like put the report away, classify it, and say goodbye to it, kind of.
Is it important to you to know if it was done, or so one thought is to try to automate this by having a status on the WCA website, and you could decide to automatically receive emails for every report when the status changes, or not. Would that be a good option for everyone?
The only problem is that it would mean an extra email instead of just an extra email in the thread, or an extra thread instead of just an extra email in the thread.
It would be designed so that it shows up in the same thread.
Okay, then it's fine.
Does anyone have concerns about trying to move towards that? Okay, so the current goal will be to head to that. If we need to make a decision that's fairly straightforward, I think no one has had trouble with this, which is you just reply in the main thread saying, here's what, based on past decisions, I think is the clear thing, and then someone else chimes in and we verify it. For new decisions, this is a bit messy. Right now we have a spreadsheet where we're voting and we're trying to make separate threads. I think this is kind of working. It just would be nice to have this a bit more formalized for the voting process. I'm trying not to share anything private during this meeting, but I think you've all seen the votes document. Does anyone have concerns about the way we're kind of currently handling it? I know we're trying to improve it, but do you have any thoughts on simple changes to make this a little bit more practical?
I think that it could be easier to have the votes just in the emails, so we don't have to use Google Drive when we are going to vote for a decision.
Mm-hmm. So my thought to that would be if you think there should be a vote, hopefully on the website we'd be able to vote, and you could also press a button there saying, I think an incident needs a vote, and then we could automatically generate an email sent to the thread, and then you could just click inside that email to vote. Does that seem like a good direction, you think?
Yeah, I think that would be perfect.
Yeah, I think we'll have to balance out how many emails you have to receive versus how many emails you can receive if you want to. I'm going to err on the side of receiving everything, so I want to process just to make sure that we're not dropping anything, because that was a problem when we only had 3 members. But it sounds like we have a rough direction to go. Where a few of you have volunteered to start learning to code for the WCA website. No one yet knows Ruby on Rails, so that will take a while. If anybody external is watching and would like to contribute to help make this process a bit easier, there's ways to test this publicly, so I'm happy to take contributions to try to speed this up so we can focus on slightly more public things. So that's reports processes. Next, I'd like to pull up priorities board. So because I work at GitHub, I'm used to using GitHub tools now. And this is nice because since we have WRC issues for the regulations on the regulations repository, so if you look at the organization here, got the regulations here, and we can discuss issues. Since a lot of this is here and we're using tagging to keep track of it, it's convenient to be able to automatically add it to a priority board. So if you go to the WCA organization on GitHub, you can view the projects tab, and I have this overall WRC Priorities board, and it contains links to these other ones. So there's one for regulations 2020. There's one for a community survey, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And there's one for code of conduct, which is not strictly WRC, but which I'm helping lead the drafting for, and Sydney is currently involved with. So if you look at the WRC priorities board right now, there's a few things that are in progress that I've marked, and a few that are, let's say, general ideas that have been put forward. Ivan sent a few of these recently. This is not nearly everything, but this is what I have there right now. So as we go through this meeting, I'd like to start putting things on the boards because I want to use them to keep track of what we're doing. And I'd love for people to volunteer to be responsible for something. So for example, I've assigned the delegate report process to myself, so you can see a little assigned to me icon. Clément and Sydney were in charge of helping schedule this meeting. And Pedro is essentially helping drive the community survey at the moment. So I'd like everyone to be in charge of something is focused towards the 2020 regulations within the next few weeks. So feel free to volunteer during the meeting, or we'll follow up afterwards.
So I'd just like to point out that I also volunteered for everything related to translations regarding the survey, which is to first translate to other languages. I mean, Antonio and Han, I think, or Kotaro, you are all motivated, or also interested in translating in your own languages. But in general, I'm like interested into splitting the task of translation for the survey and the answers if needed.
Okay, so I'm going to file 2 issues just as stubs, translate responses. Okay, so we have some for this. Okay, if you access GitHub, feel free to go, and you can have multiple people assigned. So if you'd like to volunteer, you can go here and assign yourself. Does that sound good? I will
Yep.
Well, actually, my first topic that I wanted to discuss, and we're right on time for that, is the community survey. So the community survey has a little bit of a complicated history. I actually asked the board if I could do this on behalf of the WCA last year, with the intention that I could do it unofficially if the WCA wasn't interested, because the WCA was just starting to become a nonprofit and there were a lot of things to juggle. And so I've seen other communities do this pretty well, and I thought it was worth asking in general. But then there was Laura Orndorff, who was the previous WRC leader, became senior delegate and stepped down from WRC leader. So I went for that. And instead, the community survey idea was picked up by the communications team. And then the advisory committee came along, and then the idea was the advisory committee would do it. And so Daniel Shepard sent out emails asking for questions. But it's all of a sudden become urgent again for the regulations committee, because there's quite a few things we would like to ask the community to help determine the direction of the 2020 regulations. There's some fairly large changes and some somewhat controversial changes we'd like to consider. And so that's the context for why the WRC is essentially making this move forward. We're keeping other teams in the loop, and I'm in correspondence with Daniel Shepard so that he knows where things are at, so that the advisory committee can stay apprised. So I'm going to pull this up. I have a board for the survey. We have a sort of draft schedule that we never actually finalized. This was Pedro. Was it you who drafted this? If you're trying to speak, Pedro, you're muted. All right. You still have you, Pedro?
Yeah.
So could I ask you to talk a little bit about your thoughts on planning for the community survey and the schedule?
I'm a bit rubbery.
Yeah, your connection is showing us a little bit. Okay. Well, if Pedro, if your connection manages to work well, feel free to start jumping in. I'm going to show a little bit of this.
I think I'm back.
Okay. Could you describe what you put together as for planning and for scheduling the community survey?
My thoughts on scheduling the community survey is that our main priority is to get it out. 2020 survey.
The connection seems quite poor.
Yeah. Well, we'll give Pedro a little bit to see if can dial in.
95% package loss.
Okay. I'll try to pick it up, but feel free to jump in, Pedro. Yeah, so I haven't yet mentioned the overall timeline for the regulations, which is probably a good time. Last year, because we had members constantly leaving throughout the beginning of the year, we released at the beginning of May, which is partially my responsibility because I could have tried to push for it to still happen earlier. But I just like to make sure that we stay on top of it so that we reach January 1st, because it's least confusing when the new regulations for 2020 go into effect on the first day of 2020, and the board would like to see that. And so the idea is 1 month ahead of time, we should have the regulations essentially final and ready to approve. And 1 month before that, we should have a draft that contains all the major changes we're planning to implement, so that we have a month of feedback before that final version. So that means at the end of October, we would aim to have a version with all the major things we want. And after that, we only make minor tweaks unless we discover some major problem. So that gives us about 2 months to finish the survey, send it out, and get it back. So Pedro put together a fairly fast-paced schedule to try to get this out within a week and a half from now, which we're somewhat close to still. And then the idea would be to have it out for about a week And we still need to think about things like reaching people in person or in communities that are not connected to English-speaking online communities. So for this, we have several different aspects of things we need to get done. I want to mention that we do have a draft. So if you haven't seen this yet, if you go to the Community Surveys repository, this contains draft questions. And at the top, there's also a link to a draft. So we haven't yet fully sent this out to everyone, but there's nothing secret in it, which is why it's publicly accessible. So we're going to start to ask for testing and feedback from mainly inside the WCA early, but anyone can comment with suggestions or thoughts. There's a Google Doc linked where you can comment. Right now, it's open to the public for commenting. If anybody wants to comment something, please feel free to do so, but please stay civil. So right now we have it broken down into sort of 8 main sections, 2 of which are only for WCA staff and organizers. These ask some more of the nitty-gritty stuff. There's a few of them based on what other teams have asked for, and we'll probably still be refining it for a bit. So I don't want to get too much into the exact questions in this meeting. So I'd like to think about trying to assign responsibilities for helping get this out the door. So, Clément, you mentioned translations. Do you have thoughts on the kinds of things we should watch out for when planning for translations?
The only thing is that we have to get obviously reliable people to work on this, and make sure that the wording keeps the same. For example, the reference of having must, should, for example, followed. Then I guess it will just be me contacting as many people I know that are reliable, asking them to get ready, because in the schedule we have more or less 2 days to do this. So they will be ready whenever I tell them, hey, this is the final version, please give me a list of the exact translation. I will just get it and just, I don't know how exactly yet, but the idea is that it's quickly as it's ready, sorry, as quickly as possible. Same for the answers. The answers will be the tricky part, because we might get a lot of answers, and so I will see. Some people might have some of the answers given might be irrelevant or identical to others, and we'll try to identify the answers that are really relevant and that need deeper understanding and work on.
So there's a process for handling free responses. So our hope will be to make as much of this individual questions. So just as an example, I'm to pull up you can see these are bullet points, and you can select one of these and you can translate it directly. But a few of them will have text fields. So the idea will be to minimize that. But if there's an open text field, like open feedback at the end, or something like that, you can assign, the best practice is to assign codes. The code meaning somebody mentioned this kind of thing. So maybe somebody mentioned a certain kind of event, or maybe somebody mentioned a certain kind of concern. And then there's a way to have multiple people assign codes to responses, and to determine how consistently those are assigned. And then we have some assurance that we've correctly categorized things. So there's a link to that here. But we will need help with translations for responses, definitely. One thing that came to mind is we need to set up translation tools. So if you or Han or anybody else would like to start pulling in translations or just try practicing it, we can try to set up the translation tool just to do draft translations early on. Although I'd like to avoid telling too many people to translate too often. They're not part of the core team.
Definitely.
So
I think.
Go ahead.
I think that for making translation, we should ask a translator or something like that. So that people tell us what is the best way to to get their translation, because they use some software programs that help the translations to get up to date easier.
So there is a tool written by Jonathan Kosko that the WCA website uses that has worked pretty well for that. So if there's somebody who really wants to work using another tool, I suppose we can give them a list of questions and they can translate it. But I think the tool is pretty good for just getting through the list of strings to translate. Do you have any other concerns about that?
I don't know how does it work, so I can't tell you something.
Yeah, so I think what we should do is test out that tool very soon, the next day or two, just to get an idea of if it will work for our purpose. We have some thoughts about translating the entire regulations using this, because right now the regulations are translated using a years-old process while the website uses the newer tool. But there's some concerns about, for example, using consistent wording, like Clément mentioned earlier. If we say you must do something, or if something is at the discretion of the delegates, you want that phrase to be consistent, even if things are translated at different years. So this is probably a good test to get familiar with that. Let's see. So we need to send things out to committees to test. We need to translate. We need somebody to be coordinating with the communications team about the strategy for reaching lots of people. Would someone be willing to be in charge of that?
I think it can be quite linked with the idea of translation. So maybe I can jump for this, but if someone else is more interested, more motivated, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to file an issue, and if somebody wants to take it, feel free to. Else, I guess Clément just volunteered communications outreach. So this is something I've talked about with a few of you, and Ivan wrote a few thoughts about it, but especially talking to the communications team will be an interesting one. They have a separate team in China to handle translations of certain things, so it's a wide topic.
And also, I think that Portuguese and Spanish should be unified into an only translation, because Portuguese now has Brazilian and European Portuguese, and also Spanish has American and European. I don't know for Portuguese, maybe Pedro can tell us about it, but Spanish is very similar each other, so I think it's better to only have one.
So you're talking about the regulations translations?
Yes.
Yeah. So people have brought up maintaining two similar languages is maybe not the best. We did that because there were concerns from people in this case, the American versions of the languages and the European versions, that there's some subtle differences, and there's some cases where like a common word in one place is a bit of a swear word in the other place. So if we talk to the delegates from the relative places and they think we can find a sort of common place to converge, I would be in favor of that. But I'd like to pull in people who were originally advised us that it was worth having separate translations. Let's discuss this the next few days, but I would definitely like to get back to that at some point. Let's see. I have some plans to put this into SurveyMonkey at some point, but we might have to use Google Forms, it turns out. Is there anybody who would be interested in just like maintaining the actual form to make sure that that's up to date?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, I'll work with you on that. I've been doing it, but I'd like to distribute the work for that a little. The idea is we have a draft. Hopefully, well, I'd like all of you to review it, just a sanity check as soon as possible. So after meeting you have time, I'd love for you to just go through the questions and comment if you have any thoughts. I think Ethan Pride, who's our board member, that is my contact on the board essentially. Whenever I have small questions, I think he already went through and commented. So I think we should do a little bit of revision and then start sending it to committees, which we have to plan for. Clément is going to think about translations, and we will all think about pulling in testers, which we will just do naturally as we start sending it out. Does anybody have other thoughts or concerns about the survey? All right, I'll take that as a no for now. We are still basically perfectly on time, which is good. Next, I wanted to talk about things that I think Ivan brought up in an email about the incidents log and the digest. Could you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, so right now we are not using so much in the incident log, and incident log is our best way to communicate every incident to delegates and also to the public. So I think it's very important to use it more frequently and for every single decision we make. So delegates are notified that the decision was made. So we won't have that issue in the future.
Yeah, so let me share. So here's, let's see, the documents. So when you all joined, I asked you to look at a few documents that define what we do. So we have actually in the motions for the regulations, we should be resolving issues, making decisions about incidents, advising, and then it's actually part of our job to publish regular reports. And so we used to do this in the form of a digest, because basically informing the entire list of delegates about every kind of incident seemed a bit much. Unfortunately, this has fallen behind because we were down to 3 members and it was a little bit tricky to stay on top of it. So we have a backlog of things that should become public incidents. Not everything here, not everything that is in the incidents log draft is public yet. So I'd like to definitely get to the backlog at some point, and then every 3 months, let's say quarterly, would probably be a good pace to send out major things. This is always a little bit of a tricky topic because ideally, if there's something that is a big enough deal that we should document it, we should probably put it in the regulations or guidelines. But in practice, there's lots of things that happen really rarely that don't quite fit in there. So I think there's still a place for this for the time being. But in the long term, I'd like us to think about minimizing the amount of places that someone has to look to get information. So this should really be only for rare things and more of a reference for the regulations committee to be able to answer questions by saying, here's something that happened in the past, rather than something that we expect every delegate to be able to reference, like the regulations and guidelines. Is there anyone who'd be interested in trying to get our incidents log back up to date and or handling the digests?
Yeah, I would like to do that.
Okay.
Same for me as well.
That's Antonio?
Yeah.
So I'm going to assign you for now to the issue that's in the regulations that says plan a sustainable digest, and you guys can discuss the backlog issue, which is a separate issue, versus this one. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Ivan, can I also add you?
Yes.
Han. Okay, and Ivan. All right, so that's assigned to you. Excellent. We're still perfectly on time. So in a similar vein, Ivan also mentioned our old GitHub issues. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so right now the problem is that we have about 190 users or something like that. And the problem with that is that if we want to make a change on the regulation, it's very difficult to us to find an issue that is relevant. So I propose that every issue that is not relevant, to close them. And it will be a good occasion to do that when we migrate to WCA forum. And also, I think it's important to label every issue that we can. So it's easier to identify every issue.
I didn't quite understand what you were saying about users. Could you repeat that?
And that I think it's important to label every issue.
So I have, I think, a little bit of a different opinion from most people in that I think if something is unresolved, we shouldn't pretend that we have an answer and mark it as closed. But there are a lot of old things where you kind of just need to make a choice. Is this important enough for us to address, or is it something that's not common? And I think for maybe half of the old issues, we can probably make a decision. It used to be that it was difficult to get the community to provide input, but as you mentioned, there's a plan to create a WCA forum, which is not quite ready, but hopefully soon. And that could be a good place for it. This is certainly valuable for making it easy to figure out what are the important priorities. We have the project boards that I showed earlier to prioritize, but it's a little bit difficult to navigate when we tell people, here's all our issues. You can discuss them here when there's so many. Who would be interested in trying to go through all these and helping clean that up?
I am.
All right.
And I like to do that.
So as old resolve GitHub issues, who raised their hand? That was Clément.
Me, that's me. Me and Clément. And Kotaro.
Yes, Kotaro.
And Kotaro. Okay, I have assigned you to the issue that says resolve old GitHub issues. So discuss amongst yourself and start thinking about how to do that. So that sounds good. Okay, so now goes towards more regulations-oriented topics. So these are purposely in the survey so that we don't have to spend as much time discussing what we think are best ideas when we could just ask the people whom it'll affect the most. But there's some where trying to base it on, let's say, popularity is not necessarily going to make for overall regulations that makes sense. So first I wanted to talk about some simplifications that I have in mind, and then about events. So we have a little bit over 10 minutes for that. So if we go to application window, first meeting, we go to the projects. By the way, just a small confusing thing is that if you look for projects at the top of the regulations repository, there's nothing right there. You have to go to the main organization, but I made sure everything is in that place. So regulations priorities. I have a few major ideas here, which I'd like to start having people be in charge of. And I have a few major simplifications that I'd like to group into a large proposal that says the regulations have a lot of details that make it, that means you have to keep track of a lot of things in your head as a judge or a delegate. And we can remove the number of cases without making the sport significantly different. So some of them, like saying clock pins basically don't matter, seem to be fairly uncontroversial. So there's two considerations for clock pins, one of which is just make all the clock pins maybe go down during scrambles. And I see Katie sort of scrunching her face. There's a few reasons this is a little bit of a weird change that we should be careful about, but there's also lots of reasons why clock incidents still continue to happen. So I think we should at least evaluate whether to say all the pins go down and then you can lay it flat, or maybe they don't matter at all. Katie, do you want to be in charge of evaluating these?
Sure.
Okay, I will assign them to you. Another one is for fewest moves. We constantly get questions about what is valid notation, and part of the problem is that there's rare notation that we don't fit on a sheet as like, you can use this. So as a judge, you need to know it. As a delegate, you need to know it. But as a competitor, it's a little bit unclear. And arguably, we don't need to support rotations because FMC fewest moves is an advanced event. And this would reduce the number of possible incidents without making it like if you sit down for an hour, it should be reasonable to expect you to put a solution without rotations. It makes grading easier and easier to understand. So that's one we're evaluating. And another one that we've evaluated in the past that I'd like to reconsider is what's called the solved or not policy, which is that either the attempt is solved with a puzzle at the end or not. So we have margins for misalignment, but if you have more than that on any slice, then that would count as DNF instead of +2. And then you don't have to think about if there's multiple slices or if there's a slice turn off like an M move or anything like that. It greatly reduces the number of possibilities. And since we have an average of 5, it means that if your puzzle occasionally something rarely weird happens, then you always have that extra 5th attempt to be tossed out. And nowadays that people have magnetic cubes, there should be less of an excuse that dropping the puzzle and accidentally turning was not your fault. So this is probably going to be the most controversial one, but I think it could really be useful and not actually change the, let's say, metagame too much. So I'd like to put these together, and if anybody has other ideas for simplifications that feel a bit bold, but might actually not change the sport too much, I'd love to expand on that. Does anyone have, I don't want to wholly discuss these topics, but does anybody have aspects of these particular topics or other ideas that I haven't discussed?
What do we do with all the kind of +2s we have? I mean, the one turn off is DNF now. Well, let's admit we do this. What do we do about the others? For example, inspection, we get rid of it. I think we already discussed this, but it would be good to kind of give an idea in the meeting.
Yeah, ideally, in general, I think people agree that the more +2 possibilities there are, the more difficult it is to keep track. If you've seen the score sheet that is used at Chinese competitions, they actually have a column for every possible penalty. So every penalty means one more column. I would like to solve some of this by not requiring people to learn more. So we could reduce the number of penalties by just making things DNFs instead of +2, but if we can make it systematic to avoid things. One idea with inspection, for example, is to change what hardware we use. That's a bit of a tricky topic, so I haven't put it in the agenda, but the hardware could possibly enforce conditions and make it simpler to warn and start before 15 seconds. If you have ideas for particular ones, I would say to file an issue, and then we can discuss that.
I think the hardware part was something Jules was into.
Mm-hmm. If there's not an issue, I encourage you to start one, and then we can think about.
The inspection time is now something that is really unfair between all the competitions and even all the judges. So people sometimes start inspection right when they remove the cover, sometimes 1 second later, sometimes 1 second before. And they say 8 between 7 and 9 and stuff like this. So I think we should really try to have something more consistent. So maybe your website would be a nice first step. But in the future, I think it would be a lot better if the competitors start the inspection themselves instead of having the judge do it. So that basically we don't expect the judge to measure anything precisely.
Yeah, there are some thoughts for how to use hardware to start the inspection, which I think would be better. I think this is the kind of thing we should think about towards the end of the year. But if someone has more practical ideas that don't involve significant regulations changes, I think we should certainly consider them. Does anyone have other thoughts on these simplifications that I've mentioned?
Maybe the +2 penalty.
Mm-hmm.
If we delayed it, some events like pyramids or 2x2 or skill will have a lot of DNF, and I'm not sure if this is very good.
I would argue that if you're getting DNFs, then you're not solving the puzzle. Unfortunately, in order to draw a clear line, you should probably be consistent across puzzles. So this is the trade-off with a decision like this. Do we feel okay saying you have to either be careful or willing to take the risk for those puzzles? In an average of 5, you get 1 solve. That's just, if something goes wrong, that's that. So that's the trade-off we really are evaluating. So it's part of that. You're welcome to bring that up in the issue as for those puzzles in particular, whether we should be thinking about maybe talking to people who are fast in that event or something like that a little bit extra.
I'm not sure about it.
Yeah, I expect it to be somewhat controversial, but it's one of those ideas. We've also in the past had other ideas that sound somewhat controversial. Scramble filtering used to be really controversial, for example, but that people have gotten really used to, and I think people would question if we went back. It's also one of those things that if we were designing the sport from scratch, I think seems like, why do we need that? It's there for outdated reasons. arguably, the fact that we have 15 seconds of inspection for 2x2 is also like that, but I don't think anyone particularly wants to reduce the amount of inspection at the moment. Actually,
that kind of thing that is arbitrary anyway. So whether we have 15 or 10 or 12 or 20 is just a matter of choice. So it's better to keep it that way.
I don't think we're going to get rid of inspection, so that's a good reason why changing might not be. But removing a penalty or removing a whole class of issues to judge, I think is a qualitatively worth it thing. So this somewhat leads me to the last topic, which is thinking about events. There's two topics I was hoping to get people to think about. Let me pull this up. First WRC meeting regulations. So one of which is requiring scramble signatures and other scramble secrecy stuff. We'd like to start requiring more isolation of the competitors area from the scramblers and maybe from the stage. We've been asking about this a bit in delegate reports, and there's some concerns, but is anyone interested in leading the effort to be a little bit stricter about scramble accountability?
I'd like to help with that.
Okay, I will send that to you for now. Then we've discussed simplifying some things, some which would be stricter. I have this general thought to think about leniency. So during the interviews with a few of you for the WRC, we discussed strictness versus consistency. Like making things more strict is generally the easiest way to make something consistent. The other alternative to make something consistent is to have a lot of rules, like a lot of details, which we do for valid puzzles. But there's a few places where we could be lenient a little bit, and because they happen rarely and people are not trying to exploit the regulations, being lenient wouldn't be super bad or cause much more work for us. So I'm trying to collect those here. And this is basically an attempt to listen to a lot of unstructured feedback of the kind saying, why are you strict about so-and-so? So I know not everywhere in the world feels consistently about this. Like I've talked to Baixiang from China, and my understanding is that a lot of people there ask, why do we give flexibility rather than saying you have to do this, and if not, it's a DNF. But I'd like us to keep thinking about places we are too strict, where it wouldn't be logistically tricky to be a little bit lenient. Is there anyone interested in trying to think about and collect more of these? Okay, it's a bit of a vague thing. I wanted to bring it up in case anybody has something in mind, or if anybody watching wants to suggest. I think it'd be good to evaluate these together rather than as one-off.
I'd be interested to do that.
Was that Jules?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to assign this to you for now. Yeah, and then I guess on the balance, the idea is that we want to be listening to what people say, and rather than just responding to one at a time, this is an attempt to do this systematically, as are these simplifications. That way, it's not a one-off decision. It's a principle that we've put together. So we're sort of coming quickly to end of time. The last topic was events. The most controversial topic by far right now is 3x3 with feet. The official plan is to remove it. We are going to ask, the plan is to ask on the community survey about the community's view on this, but we're also evaluating a bunch of arguments. I'd like someone to put together a full list of arguments for and against. We've done this partially, but I'd like a fully complete list. Is there anyone interested in putting that together?
I'd be interested.
All right. I'm going to make a separate issue because there's the big controversial one about that, and I will assign you to that. Then there's this issue that I've sort of taken on for myself, which is the larger question of how do we handle events. This could resolve things like feet, but is not necessarily the, let's say, an immediate effective solution. But I'd like to see if we can get something for 2020, which is to rethink this gigantic list of 18 permanent events. Talking to people at Worlds and Nationals, US Nationals at a Q&A, and a lot of people asked about events. And despite us never before having asked the community survey would be the first thing. We've never before asked what events would you like to see, but it's one of the most common requests we get to add new events. So try to balance that against the fact that adding or removing events right now is pretty controversial because any existing event people have practiced, and adding more events means every championship is expected to hold it. There's three major thoughts I have on how to resolve that. One of which is to have tiers of events. And I want to say these are not my ideas, these are ones I've collected. Another one is to have temporary events, which are around for a few years, but don't stay in the list too long so that the list doesn't get huge. And another one is to figure out to encourage unofficial events instead of normal rounds. Does anyone have, so there's a question about this on the community survey. Does anyone have thoughts on how we should think about evaluating these options to see if they're worth implementing? I should mention that Denny Mintseyev, who is not on the WRC, he's working with, I think, Vladislav, who runs funcubing.org. I hope I got that right. They're trying to put together lists of events that people care about and talk about how to do tiers. But I'm interested in trying to have someone from the WRC be in charge of that.
I can point out that I am actually also listed in the funcubing.org website as a delegate for them. So I already saw a little bit of how they work, and they're basically like WCA delegates, but with their own website. And it's mostly post-Soviet countries, CIS, if I remember right, countries that hold these unofficial events, and mostly results from old unofficial competition, events from past competitions. For example, when Kilomix or Kibimix, doesn't matter, was quite popular in some countries, for example, these results were partially uploaded. And so there's a lot of work that can be done with them, like collecting all the data from all the unofficial events. This is still ongoing because there are many comps. For example, in France, we had many comps with Team Blind included. But so there's a lot of data that we can collect. It takes time, and we'll have better ideas of what events are actually popular and appreciated. So that could enter mostly in the temporary events and event tiers.
Yes. Okay. Well, you're volunteering for everything, it seems.
No, I'm not saying that I'm volunteer, but I'm just like giving all the information I have.
Yeah, I do want to reach out to communities that have been holding this. Team Blindfolded is happening more often. I think it would be interesting to have different variety of events, like Team Blindfolded, or maybe linear FMC, which we can do with Bluetooth cubes now. Just things to experiment a bit more, which we used to do all the time, but as of 10 years ago with the official event list, doesn't happen. And I think it was a good thing when we were experimenting with new stuff, because that was part of the fun of it. So if there are communities that you know that are experimenting with stuff, I'd love to get as much collected as possible about what's going on. Okay, so that moves us through everything that was on the agenda, and just about an hour. Does anyone have any last thoughts based on this meeting?
I think we should really, I just saw that in the chat of the live stream, people, GitHub is the place to discuss regulations or make emails, but not a chat on a YouTube video, not Cubic friends. I'm just reminding this. We tend to do this sometime, and we just remind you again, go to GitHub. That's exactly the place for it.
Yeah. Well, ideally, we'll have the WCA forum soon, which should be the place to discuss more things like opinions. Right now, GitHub, which you can find from the top, you can find links to from the top of the regulations, is the place to discuss things like proposals and reasons. So it's not useful for people to say, I agree with so-and-so, as much as it is to say, here's why I think we should do this, or have you considered this part? But assuming you're being constructive, we do welcome anyone to participate on GitHub. It is the place where we document what we do and where we have the processes for these decisions. So Clemo is exactly right. And hopefully, if this was a success, I mean, we'll talk about it. We'll do something like this again. And one thought I've had for this is to maybe invite external people, as maybe leaders of particular communities, and have to have a bit of a dialogue. or to have live questions moderated by someone. So we'll talk about that. But from that, any other last thoughts? All right. Then thanks everyone in the WRC for your time, and I'll see you again sometime.
Have fun. Bye.
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 Bye.